started.
Okay, so this is just to give you some ideas about the large data set, because you're expected to be familiar with it, but you don't need to know any details really. So all of your data are taken from the 2001 and 2011 censuses in the UK. So the entire population, it's meant to be for England and Wales. And you get stuff about transport and stuff about ages. And it's for each local authority. So a local authority is like one piece of data, and the local authorities are lumped into regions sometimes. The regions are quite big. It's quite hard to say on here, but it's like northeast, northwest, etc. Okay. The thing that they want you to have some idea about is the differences between types of local authorities. So in 2009, the government lumped together some local authorities to make some unitary authorities, and that happened in England. And so they did this in 2009. So in 2001, there were just local authorities. In 2011, there were some unitary authorities. So what they've done is group together some of the local authorities to make unitary authorities, so that we can compare between 2001 and 2011. So that means that we've lost some of the individual detail from the local authorities that were in 2001, because we only use unitary authorities. We replaced them with unitary authorities. So we've lost some details, but it means we can make comparisons between 2001 and 2011. So you're meant to know we've lost some detail. Okay. However, some local authorities were retained. In England, there are two main types. There's either non-metropolitan districts in England, so that's like a normal local authority. There's not necessarily lots of cities, so that means there's less infrastructure for public transport, so that impacts perhaps on your conclusions about things. And then there's metropolitan boroughs, so they're more cities and big towns, and they will have more public transport. And then, totally different from everything else pretty much, is the London boroughs. So that within Greater London, there are lots of London boroughs because the population is so enormous. So they've had to break it into pieces that are roughly the same size as local authorities elsewhere. So these are even more urbanised, there's even more public transport. And then finally, in Wales, they made unitary authorities by lumping together old local authorities, but they did that earlier. So they've had unitary authorities for longer. But the difference is, in Wales, there aren't metropolitan or non-metropolitan, they're just bundled together. So you can't tell whether you've got somewhere that's got lots of infrastructure or not with the Welsh ones. There's no way of knowing. Right. Also, there's only one piece of bad data apparently in the data we've been given, and it was made an example of in one of the sample questions. So in 2001, instead of putting a 0 for the amount of people using underground metro, light rail and tram in the Isles of Scilly, they put a little dash. So that means that if you were working out the mean and you added up the data, that wouldn't be included. So you ought to divide by 347 rather than 348, or you'll get a different answer. But what would be even better is to replace it with a 0, add them up, divide by 348. So that there is a question based on that amongst the sample material you've had. When it says method of travel, what it means is the way somebody's travelled to work or where they're studying, and it's the longest bit of it by distance. So they might, for example, have used a park and ride, and whichever part of their journey was the longest, that's the mode of transport that will be counted. Or they might have done a bit of driving and then parked and then walked, and whichever's the longest out of them will be counted. Okay. Ages means the age that they were in years at their last birthday. The only exciting thing really is in 2001, anybody over 110 was not counted at all. They were just considered invalid. Whereas in 2011, it was anyone over 115. So that means that the age 90 and over class varies in their cut-offs for 2001 and 2011. The class widths are different. So in one of your example questions, I think it chose 105 as the top level, which is sensible because we've just cut it off for everyone at the same point. Okay, so just watch out. I think they also, they made a point of that in one of the questions. The other thing was, because local authorities were lumped into unitary authorities, that meant that the mean and median ages are not available for 2001 because we'd have just had to estimate them for the unitary authorities, and it's census data, so they don't like estimates. Okay. Right, so if you're asked to make comparisons between two different bits of data, just look for what's the same and what's different. Anything obvious. Look at the averages. Okay, so in this box and whisker plot, we can see that all of these medians are roughly the same. This one's different. Okay, compare the spread, so that's whether something's more varied or more consistent. We've got wider boxes here. We've got a much narrower box here. This is more consistent data. This is more varied data. Okay, and you can also compare skewness or symmetry. So here we can see that within the box, we've got a bit of a skew towards the bottom. Okay, so that's a negative skew, but we've got an outlier somewhere up here. So sometimes it's more complicated because this is real data than just a nice, easy, symmetric distribution like that one, or a nice, obvious skew. Okay. Right, things to watch out for in the data. So you should notice if you've got some outliers in a scatter plot. And if you do have an outlier, could you give a reason for it? Is there a sensible, obvious reason there? Or do you think it might just be a mistake in the data? There was one of the questions, and it had a scatter graph very similar to this, and you had to give a reason for why it might be an outlier. And you just use common sense for that. Looking out for skewness or symmetry or something weird like here, we've got two different modes. We've got a mode for this group and a mode for that group. Okay, so strange distributions. Read very carefully on either the data or the question, whether you're looking at populations which will vary in size, and therefore that will maybe increase or decrease the amount of transport used, or whether we're looking at the proportion of the population using that transport, which is a bit more of a fair comparison. Right. And then anytime you're making saying something about anything, you need to be super cautious and non-assertive. Okay, so nice, like it might be this or it could be that, rather than it's definitely this or definitely that. It's also useful to know that if data have been grouped, we have lost some detail. So here we've got kind of some very narrow bands on a very narrow histogram, lots of very narrow groups. If we then lump the groups together and get wider groups, we can see this looks much smoother, but we've lost this peak and trough detail. So you just have to be careful. When you group data, you do lose some information, but it sometimes makes it much easier to deal with. Okay. When we have a lot of data, which we do have here for like the entire population, then the product moment correlation coefficient does not have to be really close to 1 or -1 to be strong. If you have a small sample, it does have to be close to 1 or -1 to be considered strong. Alright, so and then this particular data, so I was just talking about the correlation before. So because we've got 348 local authorities, that's a lot. So a PMCC of 0.4 or 0.5 we normally think was weak, but actually, because we've got so much data, that's reasonably strong. And 0.8 will be extremely strong. They'll be clustered around a trend. Okay. Things that could be outliers. London is really often an outlier, both with age things and especially with the transport, because of all the public transport and people being within walking distance. Okay, rural areas might be outliers within a region. So if you've got mostly towns and then you've got a couple of really rural areas, then it could be. I remember doing one of the starter activities where we looked at the northwest region, and Cumbria and the lakes were outliers compared with Manchester, Liverpool and so on. Okay. And then just bear in mind when you're doing, they quite like getting you to think about what's happened to an age distribution over the 10 years. But you need to be careful. So the people in 2001 who were, say, 10 to 14 are not necessarily the same individuals that are now aged 20 to 24 in 2011. Some people may have moved out of the region or into the region, and some people might have died. So you have to be careful, they're not the same people. Okay. So then these are just some of the questions. I think, rather than looking at these questions, I think it's actually really helpful to look at them and look at the mark scheme. What is considered acceptable? And an awful lot of these, rather than using technical language, will accept just common sense language. Okay? So generally speaking, don't panic about them, it's mostly common sense. Okay, so just have a go at some of the stats the papers with the stats questions in, and just use some nice common sense for these. Okay, for example, here we had to give a reason for something, e.g. fewer walk to work, and over here they say any sensible equivalent. Okay, it's a bit fuzzy.